Right, hello. We're getting into the book Ghandi and Churchill by Arthur Herman. This is the prologue. I see no being which lives in the world without violence. Mahabharata. I see no being which lives in the world without violence. I don't know how to read this adequately. Hold the cell phone as close to my mouth as plausible. Mutiny. The news had spread through the hot, dusty streets of Cawnpore and its European quarters like a monsoon wind. The narrative sepoys or soldiers of the garrison at Meerut, just outside Delhi, had shot their British officers and were marching on the ancient Mughal capital. Other sepoys, it was said, were scrambling to join them. Cawnpore's English families, ensconced in their comfortable bungalows and surrounded by native servants, felt uneasy. Between Kolkata and the southeast and Peshawar to the north, a distance of 1,300 miles, there was exactly 1 battalion of British troops and 700 men. Very suddenly, in a few short days in May 1857, British rule in India, which had seemed so stable and secure for the past half-century, found itself on the edge of the abyss. One question burned in everyone's minds. Would the sepoy regiments in Kalporn remain loyal or join the rebels? One of those wondering was William Shepherd. He served in the garrison's commissariat office and had just moved his widowed sister's family to Cawnpore. Like many who worked for the British in India, Shepherd was of mixed race, half Indian and half English. Everyone in the station seemed to think something dreadful was about to happen. He knew that the small garrison town on the bank of the Ganges was weak and isolated, and that the native troops in Cawnpore outnumbered the whites by 10 to 1. If they mutinied, the nearest help would be more than 50 miles away in Lucknow, assuming the soldiers there remained loyal. Shepherd also sensed that he and other so-called half-castes, or anyone who worked with the British, would be in mortal danger if the Cawnpore sepoys joined the rebellion. But would they? Shepherd certainly thought so. In an unguarded moment, some of them had revealed the depth of their resentment toward the British and their paranoia. See what deep plots are being laid against us, the Cawnpore sepoys told him. They had already refused the new cartridges issued from the arsenal at Dum Dum for their Enfield rifles, which rumour said were smeared with pig grease so that any Muslim soldier would be polluted and any Hindu soldier would break his caste. It was fear of those same cartridges that had set off the mutiny in Meerut. Now the rumour was that their British officers were secretly mixing the commissariat flour with pig and cow bones for the same purpose, to make them all badurum, or outcasts. Shepherd knew this was a lie, but did not dare to contradict them. But he did ask why they would wish to attack civilians and others like himself who had done them no harm. They gathered menacingly around him, shouting over and over, "Sufun Sufa, Sufun Sufa." Enough is enough. It was time to wipe the slate clean, time to drive the British out of India. One veteran sepoy with bristling moustache and piercing eyes almost rushed at Shepherd. "Oh, you are all one, all of you, all of the same breed," he cried. "You are serpents, and not one of you shall be spared." The night Shepherd moved his family out of the city into Cawnpore's only entrenched position, the old Dragoon Hospital to the west of town. He had found the mood had degenerated to hysteria. Europeans and Eurasians were scrambling to get their families inside the compound, unnerved by rumours of impending trouble and angry stares from the locals. Trunks, suitcases, valises, bundles and boxes were piled in profusion. Children ran underfoot while weary officers tried to maintain order, and their wives and sisters sat exhausted in the heat. Native servants and ayahs couched fearfully in the corner. The hospital overflowed with people of every colour, sect or profession. An officer remembered later, all in terror of the imaginary foe. But Major General Hugh Wheeler, commander of the garrison, was still confident. Wheeler was 67. He had been born and raised in India. Even his wife was Indian. He thought he knew his sepoys as well as anyone did, and like most old-school British officers, he spoke fluent Hindustani. On May the 18th, even as panicky whites were pouring into the hospital and labourers were put to work building a 4-foot mud wall around it, Wheeler was writing to officials in Kolkata, "All is well in Kanpur." How long has it been? 6 minutes. I wonder how long the prologue is going to be, and I'm not understanding it. I don't really get the point. I thought it was about Ghandi and about Churchill. Oh, there's a mention of Ghandi. Churchill hasn't even been mentioned yet, which is interesting, isn't it? The book is about Churchill and Ghandi, but so far we don't bother to mention them. Besides, if any real trouble did break out, Wheeler knew he could count on the support of the local Raja of Bithur. The Raja, generally known as Nana Sahib, was one of the literally hundreds of local Indian princes who kept their independence from the British East India Company and still governed more than half of India. Nana Sahib was not one of the great princes like Nizam of Hyderabad or the Maharaja of Mysore, who between them ruled more territory than France and Germany put together. But he was wealthy, well-spoken, and at 35 years old in the prime of life. He and Wheeler had dined together, played billiards and hunted tigers together. Nana Sahib belonged to the same Hindu caste as Wheeler's wife. There was no Indian Wheeler trusted more. So when the Raja appeared at the end of May with 500 troops and cavalry dressed in glittering breastplates and helmets and flowing robes to pledge his support to the British, Wheeler was so grateful he turned the garrison's treasury over to the prince for safekeeping. It was a fatal mistake. After Nana Sahib's father died in 1851, the government of Kolkata had decided in its infinite wisdom to cut off the Raja's pension. Nana Sahib appealed to the East India Company's directors in Leadenhall Street in London. They refused to interfere. In 1857, Nana Sahib faced total ruin. Behind his sleek demeanour, Nana Sahib hated the British, and he was already scheming to become the sepoys' leader. On the warm night of June the 4th, Shepherd and his family were sleeping out on the hospital's veranda when a commotion woke him up. An anxious crowd of whites had gathered. Shepherd asked what was wrong. Someone hissed, "Listen," and pointed in the direction of the tents of the native Second Light Cavalry. In the pre-dawn blackness, Shepherd could hear the sounds of men saddling horses. There were cries and shouts, then a sudden blaze of light split the darkness. The native troopers had set the regimental riding master's house on fire and cut down their senior native officer, or Risaldar Major, who refused to join them. The next morning he was brought back still alive to the hospital enclave, his body covered with sabre wounds. He died in agony a few days later. By then another body had been discovered, that of Mr. Murphy of the East India Railway, with 3 bullets in his head. On June the 6th, the mutineers, with Nana Sahib at their head, set up cannon around the enclave, while the others ran riot through the city and shot any remaining Europeans or native Christians they found. The siege of Cawnpore had begun. It would last for 18 terrible days. More than 900 people, men, women and children, Europeans and Indians, were jammed into the hospital enclosure and its 2 brick buildings, one of which had only a thatched roof. They had no way to reach the garrison at Lucknow, who were about to be besieged themselves. Everyone who volunteered to try to sneak out to find help, including eventually William Shepherd, was either killed or captured. The Cawnpore garrison, in fact, not even a third were soldiers, was critically short of food, water and ammunition, and protected only by a shallow trench and the 4-foot mud wall around the main building. Cannonballs swept down on the helpless crowd night and day. Wheeler's own son, Lieutenant Godfrey Wheeler, was one of the first to die, beheaded by a round shot even as his sister was treating his wound from an earlier firefight. Another shot killed a soldier as he was trying to comfort his wife and twin babies, then passed through his wife's arm to maim one of their infants. Still another claimed Shepherd's infant daughter on June the 18th. He and his wife had to watch her linger in agony for nearly 36 hours, dying away gradually until she resembled the faded bud of a delicate flower. Shepherd then wrapped her tiny body in some old clothes and buried it in a hole he scratched out with a knife. It was his and his wife's 7th wedding anniversary. Shortly afterwards, Shepherd volunteered to carry a message to the garrison at Lucknow. He was captured and held by Nana Sahib's men until European troops freed him. However, his wife, his sister, and the rest of the family perished in the siege. With temperatures rising past 100 degrees during the day, and with the dust and tension, people became desperate for water. There was only one well in the compound which was exposed to sniper fire from every side. One by one, those who volunteered to draw water from it were killed. When a cannonball shattered the well house and winch, the garrison had to crawl under fire to lower the bucket by hand 6 feet down. Meanwhile, the 200 or so British soldiers and handful of loyal sepoys, as well as every man who could fire a musket, managed to beat off attack after attack. Surrounded by unburied dead bodies, festering in the heat, living on a handful of flour a day, they watched their loved ones die with no hope of relief or salvation. One stark fear drove them all. What would happen if they or their families were captured by the mutineers? They had heard that in Delhi, women and children had been hacked to death or shot, as well as soldiers and civilian males. In Jhansi, on June the 8th, rebels had rounded up every European man, woman and child and murdered them all. So it was Nana Sahib, not the Cawnpore garrison, who finally offered terms. He and his men were impatient to end the fruitless siege and move on. On June the 24th, he sent a message to those in the compound who were not part of the administration in Kolkata and were willing to lay down their arms, would have guaranteed passage to Allahabad, where the British still had a garrison. Wheeler opposed any deal with a man whose word was manifestly worthless. However, his brother officers persuaded him that once the rainy season began, and it was already overdue, their last remaining trenches and ramparts would be washed away in the monsoon. And what else could they do, they said, with such a mixed multitude in which there was a woman and a child for every man? They would have no trust in Nana Sahib. They would have to trust Nana Sahib and hope for the best. Wheeler, surrounded by the sick and dying, was sick himself. He finally gave way. He agreed to a deal by which the garrison would be allowed to march under arms down to the Ganges and embark on boats to carry them downstream to Allahabad in safety. A truly strange spectacle greeted the dawn in the entrenchment on June the 27th, remembered Lieutenant Mulberry Thompson, as a crowd of gaunt and exhausted men, women and children emerged from the battered hospital buildings. Some were barefoot and most were in rags. Soldiers had given up their shirts and women their dresses in order to make bandages for the wounded. Many were shivering with fever. According to Thompson, never surely was there such an emaciated, ghostly party of human beings as we, emaciated and ghostly certainly for a party of Europeans in India. They loaded up willy-nilly into bullock carts, palanquins, and on some 16 elephants, Nana Sahib provided and began a slow, sad procession through the city. A great crowd followed them down to the river, and many of the sepoys gathered to cheer, although some were weeping with shame and offered to help their former officers and their families carry their few last belongings. At last the procession reached the river bank. The men and women gingerly descended the steep ravine, thick with prickly pear and elephant grass, to the beach where a dozen dilapidated barges with thatched roofs were drawn up in the mud. The crowd pressed forward as Thompson and the other soldiers set down their muskets and waded out to the boats. They were standing waist deep in the water to help to load the women and children, when a sudden bugle call made everyone turn and glance back. The bank above them was suddenly thick with armed sepoys, all of them pointing their muskets into the helpless crowd. There was a tremendous crash as they poured out a volley, while from nearby houses hidden cannon opened up with grape shot. With a shout, troopers from the 2nd Light Cavalry charged down the bank with drawn swords. A soldier's wife saw one cut down General Wheeler with a sabre-cut arm across the neck. My son was killed near him, she recalled later. Some were stabbed with bayonets, others cut down. Children were stabbed and thrown into the river. She heard the youngest daughter of Colonel Williams, who had been killed in the siege, say to a soldier who was about to bayonet her, "My father was always kind to sepoys." He turned away, but just then a villager struck her in the head with his club and she fell into the water. Men hurled torches into the boats, which soon became blazing pyres. The air resounded with the shrieks of the women and children, remembered another eyewitness, and agonized prayers to God for mercy. The water was red with blood, my poor little sister crying all the while, "Oh, Amy, don't leave me." A few yards away I saw the boat containing my poor mother slowly burning, and I cowered on the deck overwhelmed with grief. Lieutenant Thompson and a few of the men managed to climb into one of the barges. The boat's oars were gone and the rudder was shot away. It slowly drifted into the current while bullets whizzed and chipped at the gunwales. The wounded and the dead were entangled in the bottom of the boat. Thompson remembered as they floated out of range. The men looked back with helpless rage at what was happening on the shore. Smoke from musketry and cannon and from boats that had been set on fire hung thick over the river bank. When the shooting stopped, all the surviving men were dragged away and killed. The remaining women and children, about 125 in all, were herded up the bank. 7 girls, 4 British and 3 Eurasian, including Wheeler's youngest daughter, were taken away by sepoys from the 2nd Cavalry. The rest were herded back through town to wait whatever fate Nana Sahib and the mutineers had in store for them. Well, that just sounds really awful. Really, really awful. And I don't know why we're starting at the 1857 Indian Mutiny. I think that's what they call it. As I said, there's no mention of Ghandi. There's no mention of there might be some explanation here. Oh my God, they mention Osama bin Laden. I'm reading on page 12. Hodson went to bed that night very tired, but very much satisfied with the day's work. On all sides, he wrote, he received congratulations for my success in destroying the enemies of our race. The heirs to the last Mughal emperor, direct descendants of the great Tamerlane, were dead. British rule in India was secure. Bit by bit, order was restored. The last rebel holdout at Gwalior fell on June the 19th, 1858. In March, Bahadur Shah was tried by a military court and found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to exile for life in Rangoon in far-off Burma, where he died and was buried 4 years later in November 1862. However, one rebel leader escaped capture. Nana Sahib had faked suicide after the fall of Cawnpore in hopes of eluding his British pursuers. His aide-in-general, Tania Tope, was caught and executed in April 1859, but Nana Sahib was never found. Hodson had said hanging him would have been a positive pleasure. There were persistent rumours that Nana eventually died of fever in Nepal, but they were never confirmed. For decades, officers in remote hill stations in northern and western India would report sightings of the ever-elusive Raja of Bithur. The last would be in 1895. Like some Victorian Osama bin Laden, the memory of the man Havelock called a devil incarnate would haunt the British Raj down to its final hours. The retribution for what he had done would scar India forever. Today, Cawnpore has been renamed Kanpur, and the marble angel that once stood on the site of the Bibigar well is gone, but the red brick neo-Gothic church built to the memory of the European victims still remains. It serves as a reminder that for a few terrible months in 1857, violence had been met with violence, and the seeds of future violence had been sown. The British Empire in India, which seemed stronger than ever in the years after the Great Mutiny, would one day reap the whirlwind. Now those pictures, I think they were the beginning ones. I think it's going round again. Why do we start here? On page 13, seems to be the very first mention of Ghandi. British soldiers and officials were almost unknown in the city. Porbandar was one of many parts of India untouched by the uprising. Instead, its prosperous Hindu and Muslim merchants were still ruled, as they always had, by their local prince, the Rana of Porbandar. That same year, when the streets of Kanpur and Delhi were flooding with blood, the Rana's Diwan, or chief councillor, Karamchand Ghandi, was taking his new wife and bride through Porbandar's happily bustling avenues to his family home. Karamchand was 40, tall and distinguished looking. His bride was barely 12. This was Karamchand Gandhi's fourth marriage. His first two wives had died before being able to produce him a male heir. The third had been terminally ill when he made his marriage contract in the traditional Hindu way with the family of his new bride, Putlibai. For her family it was a good match. The Gandhis belonged to a higher jati or subcaste, and Karamchand was an important man of affairs, as well as a man of property and piety. His house stood near the centre of town, next to a temple dedicated to Lord Krishna, and surrounded by elegant buildings made of bright, luminescent limestone that gave Porabandar the name of the White City. At sunset, Karamchand and Poraband's other residents would set small lamps on their doorsteps as part of some religious festivals, bathing the white limestone in a gentle amber glow. Karamchand Gandhi's house was a fine one, with 3 stories that his grandfather had bought from a Brahmin woman 80 years earlier. The original deed, written in the local language of Gujarati and witnessed with the seal and swastika of the Rana himself, still survives. An ancient Indian solar disk and traditional sign of good luck that the Nazis later made into a symbol of Aryan racial purity. The top floor, sunlit and fanned by the sea breezes, was where Karamchand's father conducted his daily prayers every morning for 2 hours. All the Gandhis were members of the Baniya caste, devout Hindus and Vaishnavas, or devotees to the cult of Vishnu and Lord Krishna, whose temple next door they visited twice a day. In the bottom floor of the house was a room less than 20 feet long and 13 wide, where Karamchand's bride would spend her entire life. It was dark, so dark that even at midday one needed to light the oil lamp to see, and stifling hot in summer, yet it was the centre of life for the household and the woman in the Ghandi family. There she arose every morning before anyone else and retired after anyone else had gone to bed. On the one side was a tiny kitchen where she prepared the family meals. On the other, an even tinier room where her mother and sister lived. It was into that room that Putlibai, on October the 2nd, 1869, retired to give birth to her 5th and last child. In a Vaishnava household like the Gandhis, everything related to in a Vaishnava household like the Gandhis, everything related to childbirth was considered a gross form of pollution. No one else entered the room except a midwife of the lowest caste. After the child's birth, the room would be subject to days of ritual purification and cleansing. Karamchand's mother, however, was allowed to speak to Putlibai through the doorway. It was she who would inform the wives of her other sons and her granddaughters that Putlibai had given birth to a son. They would be jealous. Surely Putlibai must be favoured by the gods, since only one of her 4 children was a girl. For the next 10 days, Putlibai and a new infant lay together in the sweltering chamber lit by only a single oil lamp, but the baby was safe and well. Another daughter would have been problematic. The Aitareya Brahmana had proclaimed to Hindus for 3,000 years that to have a daughter is misery, and female infanticide, officially forbidden by the British, was not unknown in the region. But this was a son with a large head and hands, and a priest astrologer was immediately brought in to cast his horoscope. It was favourable, and out of the letters he recommended as most auspicious, his parents formed the name Mohandas. He would be Put Libai's favourite, the spoiled youngest child in a large, pious, active household. His mother prayed daily that Lord Krishna should make her Mohandas a hero among heroes, but as life in the house of Ghandi returned to normal and the tiny glowing lamps were set out on the doorstep for evening worship, she could never have guessed what a hero he would become or how. Yeah, it's just occurred to me, if we're comparing, and I assume we are, Ghandi and Churchill. Ghandi got assassinated and Churchill didn't. The Churchills in the Raj, and Blenheim's Tower shall triumph o'er Whitehall. Anonymous Pamphleteer 1705. Is there going to be a mention of Bleeding Churchill or the Churchills? So we're going back to the, obviously when the two were born. On November the 30th, 1874, another baby boy was born on the other side of the world. This one also first saw light in his grandfather's house, but on a far grander scale, indeed in the biggest private home in Britain. Surrounded by 3,000 acres of green lawns and shining water, banks of laurel and fern, groves of oak and cedar, fountains and islands, Blenheim Palace boasted 187 rooms. It was in a draughty bedroom on the first floor that Jenny Jerome Churchill gave birth to her first child. Dark eyes and hair was how her 25-year-old husband, Randolph Churchill, described the boy to Jenny's mother, and wonderfully, very pretty, everybody says. The child's baptised name would be Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. If the Ghandis were unknown outside their tiny Indian state, the Churchill name was steeped in history. John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, had been Europe's most acclaimed general and the most powerful man in Britain. His series of victories over France in the first decade of the 18th century had made Britain a world-class power. A grateful Queen Anne had given him the royal estate at Woodstock, on which to build a palace which he named after his most famous victory. For Winston Churchill, Blenheim Palace would always symbolise a heritage of glory and a family born to greatness. Yet the first Duke of Marlborough had been followed by a succession of non-entities. If the power and wealth of England expanded to unimagined heights over the next century, that of the Churchills steadily declined. The vast fortune that the first Duke accumulated in the age of Queen Anne was squandered by his successors. When Randolph's father inherited the title in 1857, the same year the Great Mutiny raged in India, he had been faced, like his father and grandfather before him, by debts of Himalayan proportions and slender means with which to meet them. Randolph's grandfather had already turned Blenheim into a public museum, charging visitors 1 shilling admission. Randolph's father would have to sell off priceless paintings, including a Raphael and Van Dyck's splendid equestrian portrait of King Charles I, still the largest painting in the National Gallery, the fabulous Marlborough collection of gems, and the 18,000 volume Sunderland Library in order to make ends meet. And I'm stopping here.